pour au quotidien. C'est sur
On June 7th, 1998, 49-year-old James Byrd Jr. was walking home in Jasper, Texas. A pickup truck with 3 men in it pulled up next to Byrd, and one of the men asked Byrd if he wanted a ride home. Byrd accepted. The 3 men took Byrd to a secluded county road, pulled him out of the car, beat him, and urinated on him. They then chained him by his ankles to their pickup truck and dragged him along the road for about 4 kilometers. The men would later say how they had enjoyed watching how Byrd had tried to shift from side to side, perhaps to ease the pain, and how he had struggled to get to his elbows and keep his head up while being dragged along the asphalt road. Byrd's right arm and head were ripped off as his body hit a culvert. The 3 men then dumped the rest of his body and drove off to go to a barbecue. The killers were Sjöberg, Lawrence Russell Brewer, and John William King. Brewer and King were sentenced to death. Berry was spared because there were indications that he had tried to kill Byrd before the dragging torture. The murder still affects the Jasper community to this day. In the immediate aftermath, some called for a slow death for the 3, quote, racist monsters. But these men are not monsters. And they are probably, or were in Brewer's case, not educated enough to understand race, or to understand where racism comes from. They probably didn't even hate James Byrd. Nature and nurture made them do what they did. They had also probably bought into an idea. These 3 men had come to believe that what happened on that road in Jasper was the order of things as they should be. Of course, Berry, Brewer, and King should be held accountable. But we're going to find out what makes us violent, and we're going to see what makes us hate. But also, why we may just feel offended or hurt. Because if we understand all that, we've come far on the way to taking individual responsibility. The world isn't going out of control. You could most likely pick any one day in the history of humankind, and on that one day, people would probably say something like, the world has never been more violent than today. On most days though, they would most likely be wrong. Because in spite of what we see and hear, and in spite of what we like to tell each other, we all know that wars begin and end, and violent crime rates go up and down. Most often down. In fact, not so long ago we saw a year with the lowest global number of murders in ages. Still, aggression and violence are part of human behavior. For as long as we've been able to come up with ideas, we've also come up with ways of tormenting other humans. Whether it's kids fighting in the street, a husband killing his wife, abuse in social media, or a mass shooting, we do have it in us to physically and psychologically oppress one another. I believe in the good in human beings. I believe in some kind of light in all of us. But I've also always been interested in knowing what in the human condition makes us oppress each other. Aristotle said, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And this film is about that, knowing ourselves. Because if we truly do know ourselves, understand the aggression within ourselves, and know how to stop it from making us discontent, then imagine what could come of the universe.
notre quotidien. C'est sur
I am not a video photographer and certainly not a video director. But I took my outdated video camera and my mobile phone and went looking for facts. Answers to why we sometimes turn violent. What makes humans act aggressively? And why are some of us so easily offended? Feel so strongly that we have to win an argument or be right? We've come a long way from when people such as Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau philosophized about the origins of human savagery. Thanks to what Charles Darwin started, we now understand evolution, and thanks to those who've come after, we know a lot more about natural selection, about genes and about animals, including humans. Most of us have a more scientific approach to human behavior today than when more or less confused men simply thought up ideas from deep in their armchairs. As we'll see, we may have come to a point in time where violence is not such a big mystery. I wouldn't really call myself a pacifist. I do self-defense and fighting training, Krav Maga for example, and while that's really about avoiding or suppressing violence and about physical fitness, I really enjoy an intense sparring fight. If my family were seriously threatened, killing would not be unthinkable to me. I prefer empathy and compassion to anything else, but taking someone down gives me a feeling that I can only describe as positive. So, what would someone say about human aggression who's investigated countless violent crimes and who's come face to face with hundreds of murderers, but who isn't concerned about the reasons behind the violence? Leif G.W. Persson is Sweden's most experienced and well-known criminology professor. And he says that himself, he's not a psychologist. He wants to know what happened and who did it. What would he say about individuals who, for example, kill? The setting is Sweden, a country with about 100 murders a year.
Jag har ungefär 100 per år kan man säga. Och 90 av den är väl av den där typen att folk har hamnat i en situation som de inte har kunnat hantera. Och de är oplanerade och de var som sämst när det hände och så vidare. Och sen har vi kanske då 1 på 10 som är, eller kanske 2 på 10, då är endast lite, som är överlagt och planerat.
So, out of 10 violent acts, 8 or maybe 9 are more or less unplanned, in the heat of the moment or so-called crimes of passion. 1 or maybe 2 acts of violence are planned, calculated, cold. So, can these numbers be applied not only to the acts themselves, but also to the human beings who carry them out?
Det vanliga grova våldsbrottet, om vi tar ett mord exempelvis, det är en person som han hamnar i ett upprört läge av den där vanliga skälen. Han kanske har nära till knytnävarna, han har druckit, han kan inte behärska sig. Han har en ganska dålig historia med den här personen som han kommer i konflikt med. Och sen så inträffar en situation som man inte klarar av att hantera. Och rent sådär praktiskt, manuellt, så då är det ju ganska lätt att ta livet av en annan människa. Sådana handlingar är nästan alltid oplanerade. Sen har du ju andra våldsbrott, de här uppgörelser mellan kriminella, de kan ju vara närmast överplanerade då. Och det är nog en annan typ av... Det är ju en skillnad mellan att på grund av fylla, galenskap eller svartsjuka eller vad du vill ge sig på en annan människa jämfört med att göra det med kallt blod så att säga, för att du vill uppnå någon form av vinning eller för att du vill röja undan någon som stör din tillvaro eller whatever, va. Så att där har en väsentlig skillnad. Och jag har nog träffat betydligt fler av den första sorten än av den andra. De första kan vara ganska medelsamma, medan de andra är ju minst sagt svårpratade. De har liksom inga synpunkter på det hela.
We're going to leave out the 2 out of the 10 here. We all know that there are those who, due to personality disorder, mental illness or brain injury, lack the ability to feel empathy or to practice self-control. The broad term for a range of disorders, psychopathy, for example, is certainly a cause of violence. And in the book The Anatomy of Violence, British psychologist Adrian Raine brings up brain injury and the example of Finis Gage. In a work accident sometime in the 1840s, an iron rod went completely through Gage's head and severely injured the frontal lobe. And that changed Gage's personality forever. His friends, who had described him as a calm, considerate and friendly person, now said he had become belligerent, mean, and even violent. Gage's case was the beginning of examining brain disorder and brain injury as a cause of aggressive behavior. We'll leave illness and injury out and instead look at the potential aggressive behavior in all of us, or in the 8 or 9 out of the 10. But briefly, what would Passion, who's seen so much violence, say? Are we violent by nature? Has he come to any conclusion about us healthy, uninjured, legally and medically sane humans? Are we the good or, quote, evil?
Nej, det har jag inte. Jag tror ganska få människor som är onda. Och hur de har blivit det är ju en smakfråga. Jag tror en kombination av att de har usla erfarenheter av omgivningen. Plus att de har ganska knackig genetiskt betingad förmåga att hantera sin aggression.
So the criminology professor said it. It's partly about our genes. From the Big Bang to the primeval soup, via bacteria and the first eukaryotes, to life on land and our human-like ancestors, the Homo sapiens. Our genes are not so much the blueprint of who we are, but perhaps the programming or code that eventually draws up the finished blueprint. Genes pass down from individual carrier to the next in line, from generation to generation, and in combination with what happens to us as we carry the genes through our lifetime, that is our environment, genes make us who we are. In much of his work, such as the book with the grossly misunderstood title, The Selfish Gene, Professor Richard Dawkins explains that it is the gene, or the replicator, that is at the center of evolution by natural selection. The sole purpose of our genes, the replicators, is to survive. Survive by continually replicating along the generation lineage, and in order to do that, they need a vehicle. We then are the vehicles. And the genes, the program, has drawn up an anatomy for its vehicle that best benefits the survival of the gene. Of course, and over millions of years, that program undergoes changes, upgrades if you will, as we need to adapt to the world around us and because that world changes. Those upgrades in the program and changes in the world, or evolution by natural selection, is why an increasing number of humans are not developing wisdom teeth, or why we get so-called goosebumps. And most animal behavior, including aggression, partly originates in our genes, as they exist to keep the vehicle alive. Remember, partly originates in our genes.
Yes, I mean, I suppose we are animals, we're primates, we're mammals, and we show the same kinds of behavior in similar circumstances, and so the sorts of aggression you get when people lose their temper, when people have a fight in a pub, get into an argument and then it escalates, that probably has similarities to the sorts of evolved animal aggression.
But genes do not make us specifically aggressive. They will program us to behave in a way that promotes survival, be it by behaving aggressively, passively, or kindly. While we are the vehicle, the gene vessel, it isn't all that we are. The nature versus nurture debate is over. Behavioral experts, psychologists, evolutionary scientists, and most others know that it is nature and nurture.
To say that something is the result of genes doesn't mean you can't control it. It's very important to understand that. All sorts of things are programmed into us by genes, but we control it. We have sex drives, we have urges to mate with members of the opposite sex, and we control them, and we do it by socially civilized methods rather than by sort of primitive jumping methods.
We will get back to those socially civilized methods, how the social contract influence our behavior. But for now, we know that our genes' ambition to survive influences our behavior. And aggression would certainly be one such favored behavior, sometimes. But what about the opposite? What about, for example, empathy?
Well, empathy is another thing that I think most of us feel, and I think it, you're asking me as a Darwinian, and I think it dates back to a time in our ancestral past when we wouldn't probably have lived in fairly small kin groups, and also groups where we would know everybody else in the group. So we would be accustomed to repaying favors and having favors repaid. So we would have a feeling of empathy towards members of the group, partly because natural selection favors empathy towards kin, and partly because it favors it towards potential reciprocators of that empathy. Nowadays we no longer live in small tribal groups, but the rule of thumb in the brain is still there, dating from that past, just as the rule of thumb to enjoy sex is still there, even though we use contraceptives and therefore we're no longer using sex to procreate. We still have the same rule of thumb. It's the same with empathy, and probably the same with aggression as well.
So how have genes programmed us Homo sapiens to behave? A popular and sensationalist theory is the theory of man as a warrior. We supposedly rage against other members of our species to survive, and the only way to make it in the world is to defeat other humans. There are often references to chimpanzee groups here, which are sometimes aggressive and sometimes raid other chimp groups. As often, they don't. And the more peaceful bonobo, an equally close relative of humans, is usually left out in the comparison of humans to apes. There have also been media revelations about a human warrior gene. There is no gene that deserves that kind of name. The best way to understand how we are programmed would be to study human behavior throughout the history of Homo sapiens and our ancestors. American anthropologist Douglas Fry has done just that. What would he say about the claim that humans are aggressive by nature?
To start proposing that we have an innate drive or something in our human nature that pushes us to kill, I think it's just patently absurd if you just start thinking about it in terms of all the human behaviors that we see and the rarity of actual killing.
Throughout his career, Douglas Fry has challenged another theory, the deep roots theory, which states that war and aggression is deeply rooted in human nature. It's a popular theme in Hollywood and in the media. To Douglas Fry, though, it doesn't make sense. Genes program us, their vehicles, to stay alive, be it by being aggressive, by being generous, or perhaps by doing what we can to impress our peers or a potential partner. So at least for the part of our behavior that is genetically determined, the deep roots theory, or any other warrior narrative, doesn't seem to hold up.
I say that let's step back and look at mammals especially, but we can look at the animal kingdom even more broadly. And we see what I like to call agonism instead of aggression. And I prefer agonism because it's a broader concept that includes threat displays that have no contact, for instance, or warning calls of different types, and then the contact aggression as well. And then the contact aggression is also set up in many circumstances to be non-lethal. In other words, it's ritualized or it's patterned. And a lot of species engage in aggression that is not really intended to kill members of the same species. So the key question for me is taking an evolutionary / cost-benefit analysis point of view. And some biologists have used game theory to facilitate this type of thinking and so forth. And basically what they find is that aggression is a tool for animals to get what they need, some sort of resource. Sometimes the resource would be a mate, other times it would be a territory in which then you could have a mate and grounds to rear your young. It can be various resources, but animals are fighting over something more often than not. And of course sometimes they might fight just to defend themselves, but when we're talking about fighting within the species, there's reasons for this. So there's also costs to the aggression. So if you're fighting with a friendly individual, you may lose that individual as your animal friend. If you're fighting with family members and happen to wound them, that's looked at as an evolutionary deficit because you're sharing genes or alleles with the same relative that you're hurting. And then you're putting yourself at risk.
But that was about the animal kingdom. Douglas Fry has, however, spent his life studying hunter-gatherers. Our ancestors and Homo sapiens were hunter-gatherers or nomadic foragers until as recently as about 12,000 years ago. That is our program history. So to find out how we have become programmed to behave, one needs to look at hunter-gatherers. In a study in 2012, Douglas Fry and Patrik Sjöberg of Åbo University in Finland investigated cases of lethal aggression in a sample of 21 hunter and gatherer societies. They found traces of only 148 events of lethal aggression. And almost 2 out of 3 of these were either perpetrated by lone individuals, were accidental, or were executions of group members or outsiders that were considered a threat to peace or to survival. There were no mass murders or explosions of mob violence.
We looked at every single incidence of lethal aggression. We did not ahead of time specify, is this a hunting accident, is it a murder, is it a homicide, is it a feud, is it war? We didn't do that. We just recorded who's involved, who were the perpetrators, who were the victims, how many were killed, males or females on both sides, what were the reasons for this. Our overall conclusion, and this is a database conclusion, was that there are many examples in these nomadic foragers of individual disputes. And 2 men fighting over a woman is pretty typical. Or say a brother or other close family member seeking revenge against the killer of someone close in his family. That also occurs with some regularity, but it tends to stop right there with the second killing balancing the first killing, and people understand there's a sense of justice. A killer killed, now he was killed, okay, end of story, on with our lives. So they're very interpersonal, in other words. What was occurring less often were some sort of back and forth feuds. So the significance of this is, again, humans, like other mammals, we do threaten. We do a lot of nonverbal threatening. When we do attack, we do so with restraint. We don't immediately try to kill and go for the jugular. There's exceptions to that, but as a pattern, and this is what we see in the mammals. So humans are not totally passive, but the number one principle for me is how we manage to all the time be weighing this cost-benefit analysis unconsciously in our heads as to that's risky, I'm going to just back off, or here I might actually prevail and there's a reason for me to do so, so I'm going to attack. But most of us, most of the time, are pretty passive. And I sometimes ask people I'm lecturing to, a lecture hall, 100 people or more. You know, when was the last time you killed somebody? I haven't yet gotten somebody raising their hand and saying yes, but I'm sure sooner or later there's going to be an ex-military person in the audience and they have killed in combat. Or maybe there will have been a murderer in the audience.
So is it possible to measure how dominant genes are in determining our behavior and our aggression? And to what degree other factors come into play? It is. While many evolutionary biologists approach genes as replicators throughout generations, some look at genes in a different perspective. This is neurosurgeon Rickard Sjöberg. In his research on aggressive behavior, he attempts to look at specific parts of the DNA molecule.
A gene is made up of several building blocks, nucleotides. And different combinations of these building blocks provide the templates for the body's production of proteins. And proteins make humans work. Proteins do it all. Everything from holding our skin together to sending signals from the eye to the brain that the arm should reach for a piece of food or a tool.
And scientists are now becoming able to determine exactly how big a part these proteins, genetics, play in shaping our behavior. And they do it partly through studies of twins and adopted children. Such studies have shown that genetics account for about 50% of our aggressive behavior. For example, in 2000, psychologists Adrian Rain and Laura Baker gathered over 1,000 9-year-old identical and fraternal twin pairs and had them undergo a wide range of tests and interviews. Then, the results from the identical twins were compared to the results of the fraternal twins to determine the roots of any aggressive behavior. What was found? The genetic influence was clear, just under 50%.
När det gäller många typer av beteende så hamnar man någonstans i regionen 40%. Aggression kan mätas på många olika sätt, men där har man en del studier kommit upp emot 50% förklarat utav genvariation. Och, men beroende lite på hur man mäter så finns det en del mått då som ligger betydligt under 50% också, under 40% också. Det finns en variation mellan studier, men någonstans där brukar man landa sig 40% ungefär i beteende som förklaras utav genetik i de här studierna.
So, which genes? One of them is the MAOA gene. This is the one that, oddly enough, has been called the warrior gene. It regulates or codes for the protein monoamine oxidase A, or MAOA. This protein is essential to the function of neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine, both known to affect the ways in which we control our impulses and react to stress. In 2006, Rickard Sjöberg and his colleague Kent Nilsson used DNA tests and interviews to study the correlation between this particular gene, psychosocial influence, and violent behavior.
De här två sakerna kommer inte bara att kunna läggas ihop så att de plussar på varandra, så får man en förklaringsmodell så att säga. När de här två möts, när en viss genvariation och en viss miljöpåverkan möts, då skapas någonting helt nytt i samverkan mellan de här två. Så att det blir alltså en interaktionseffekt och inte en, som man säger, additiv effekt.
It was an attempt to confirm an earlier groundbreaking study in New Zealand by psychologists Avshalom Caspi and Terry Moffat. Sjöberg and his team wanted to determine why some children who are neglected or abused grow up to develop antisocial behavior when other children who are also mistreated don't. They found that variations in the MAOA gene played a significant part. Children with high levels of the MAOA protein who grew up in tough conditions were less likely to develop aggressive behavior than those who were also mistreated as kids but who had low levels of the protein.
Så kan man säga att en variation som var förknippad med en lägre produktion utav det här proteinet Den variationen kom att inte egentligen ha så stor betydelse för aggressivt beteende om man växte upp under trygga omständigheter. Men om man växte upp under otrygga omständigheter så kom det öka risken för kriminellt beteende i ungdomsåren.
The other factors, the non-genetic influence, is of course our environment. Today, we know for certain that there are specific environmental factors that increases the risk of antisocial or violent behavior in humans. Along with countless similar studies, one of the longest running and most rigorous study on delinquency and antisocial behavior, the Cambridge study in delinquent development, have established what those factors are. So-called broken homes, that is homes with separated parents or one parent absent, is listed as a factor. But simply having separated parents is not a cause of antisocial behavior in and of itself. It is more likely that conflict and violence in the home is the real factor. And conflict is more likely to occur in broken homes where families are split up. Poor child rearing methods. Parents who are violent or engage in criminal activity are more likely to raise antisocial individuals. Neglect. Children by parents who are cold and rejecting are more likely to become cold as adults. Abuse. Children who are abused are more likely to become abusive in adulthood. Peer pressure. It sounds simple, but we'll get to that in a minute. If you grow up in an area with low socioeconomic status, you are statistically more likely to commit aggressive offenses later in life. But it is less clear if that is because the other listed factors are more common in these areas. So, can we learn to hate? Learn to want to hurt another human being? Yes, someone who has seen how it happens up close is Kubai, an associate professor and scholar who has spent her life studying violence. Kubai has come face to face with hundreds of murderers, rapists and terrorists. And shortly after the Rwandan genocide, Kubai was the only one allowed to interview those who were now imprisoned for taking part in the mass killings. She spoke to hundreds of them, and she discovered an environment that created and fueled aggression.
People are not born killers. People are not born haters. People learn to hate. And in the case of Rwanda, it was a long process of learning to hate each other.
Of course, it's to simplify a bit to say that violence can be taught by just telling individuals they are different and better than others. Because for that to happen, a deep-rooted idea needs to be in place. In Rwanda, the idea of Tutsis and Hutus being different has a long history dating back to kings and cattlers arguing over grazing territory in the late 17th century. Then there's the impact of the so-called missionaries, the white European colonialists who further enforced the us and them idea, claiming that members of one group in Rwanda were more like white people, and therefore better than the lower standing members of another group. Add to that a civil war since 1990 between a Hutu government and Tutsi guerrillas, a failed roadmap to peace, and the suspicious shooting down of the Rwandan president's plane.
And we shouldn't forget the element of the Hamitic theory. Which, when the missionaries come into Rwanda, they realize that the Tutsi and Hutu are different socially. But then they try to explain this difference with reference to the Hamitic theory and argue that the Tutsi must have come from outside. They cannot be native to the Central Africa region because they had a very elaborate monarchical system. So the argument from the Hamitic point of view was that these people must have some origin somewhere else. Most likely must have been influenced by Middle Eastern civilization. And they defined the Tuts as people who were superior to the ordinary local population of the Bahutu people. They were tall, so the height became something important, with the fine jaws, faces, straight noses, thin lips. All this was used to differentiate between the Hutu and the Tutsi. And you see, these are differences that someone cannot change, because it is the way they look, the physical features became important in explaining the differences. All these descriptions helped to crystallize the differences between Hutu and Tutsi, and actually this radicalized the differences between the Hutu and the Tutsi. And the consequence was that people began to believe in entrenched differences between communities that cannot be either removed or changed. And by 1959, we get a social revolution where the Flemish missionaries begin to talk about sociological majority, meaning the Hutu. Therefore, they turn the tables on the Tutsi. The Hutu become the sociological majority that should therefore not be ruled by the minority, and the whole idea of the Tutsi having been alien from some other place gets the support, especially from the church. And this is how the doctrine gets completely embedded in the psyche of both communities.
What can we learn from what those who murdered their neighbors, friends and relatives told on Kubai? How did this violence begin?
From very early, the kids were taught that you are Tutsi, they are Hutu, and you are different, you are not the same. So in many cases they grew up knowing that. And they say in these interviews that when they were in primary school, they didn't know that they were different. But when they were in secondary school, they were told by the teachers and by other people, adults, that they are different. So they would go home and ask their parents, what are we? Are we Hutu or Tutsi? Then they would be told they are Hutu or Tutsi. And they would be explained what the difference is between them. And so they would learn that the difference is important for them.
Unlearning such deeply entrenched hatred, Kubai says, is very difficult.
But I want to say that when it comes to hate, I think my research in Rwanda has shown me that since no one is born a hater, people learn to hate. It's a process through which people go to become such haters as to kill their own families, to kill their own friends, to kill people that they know, as they did in Rwanda, to dehumanize them, because you know they were dehumanized as cockroaches. To come to that point, there must be a very strong belief in one thing, which is the difference between groups, between us and them. And the difference in terms of one group being better than the other in a way that cannot be changed.
Groups, crowds of people. Natural selection certainly seems to take place on the individual level, but peer pressure and everything else that takes place in a group of individuals has, without a doubt, a clear effect on our behavior.
I think really that if we talk about a human nature, which would mean characteristics that tend to manifest themselves cross species, given a variety of different social and ecological conditions, what we see over and over is that humans live in groups. Humans must be born into a group to learn a language. Human infants are extremely dependent, and it takes adults and older individuals to rear these children. If you start looking at human nature characteristics, we see that it's very important to get along within a society and within the group. And those individuals who don't manage to do that find themselves criticized, mocked, harangued at, perhaps pushed out of the group, ostracized in the ultimate sense. So group living has been really important for humans, and we can imagine that one reason for this is, protection against predators. We don't have very large canine teeth, as a species. So we lost that early on. It now is appearing, if we look at the fossil evidence for human evolution. So group living for sharing resources. Another really critical element of group living, every single nomadic forager ethnography that I have ever read talks about sharing meat. There are no exceptions. This is something that just plain happens, and if you look at it from a cost-benefit or just plain common sense point of view, there are not refrigerators on the Serengeti. So one hunter kills an animal, there's too much meat for he and his immediate family to eat, so he shares that meat and everybody gets something to eat. And the next day he's unlucky, he doesn't kill another animal, but somebody else does. Hunter-gatherers share meat. Nomadic foragers share meat. They also share childcare. They take care of the elderly, and so forth. They cooperate in various ways. So when we talk about human nature, I'm proposing that we actually have a very pro-social human nature.
Peaceful.
Peaceful, yes. So we show that restraint. We don't want to get into conflicts all the time. We understand that harms relationships, and this stems, from the work by the eminent primatologist Frans de Waal, pointing out that even non-human primates and a variety of other species reconcile after an aggressive episode because the relationship is important. And they've tested this and they found this pattern of reconciliation across numerous species, and certainly well represented within primates. And it's something that we humans do clearly as well, and we're tuned to this.
There are genetic remnants in us of needing to belong to and be accepted by a group. Many of us have abandoned that need. But some humans will still do things as part of a group that they would not allow themselves to do on their own. Clifford Stott is a social psychologist. He calls himself a crowd psychologist, and his work and consultation has changed the way police all over the world operate during events where large crowds and violence are expected.
So crowds are fundamentally important because they are vehicles of change. And in that moment through which crowds start to act, they're often driven by a sense of collective identity, where the people acting in those crowds are no longer driven by individual identity. They're driven by a shared collective and social identity about themselves as Ukrainians, or themselves as Democrats, or themselves as of a particular political persuasion, or a particular affiliation to a sports club, or a particular identity that's relevant in that particular crowd at that particular time in that particular way. So yes, people shift, but it doesn't involve a loss of individual identity. It involves the replacing of individual identity with a social identity. And it's the characteristics of that social identity that help us to understand what a crowd will do, what a crowd will find acceptable, what a crowd will focus on in terms of its activity. And if it does become a violent crowd, then who they will target in terms of that violence, because we often hold the assumption that riots are random explosions of violence, but they're not. They're actually very focused, very targeted, and it's specific targets of attack. So if we think to the crowd violence of 1930s Germany, the streets of Munich when that collective so-called mob violence happened, they were attacking Jews. Well, why Jews? Because those crowds were at times driven by National Socialist identities, which defined themselves in opposition to the Jewish people, and as a consequence of their pathological political position, understood that it was legitimate to attack those people. And that notion of social identity helps us to account for why it is that people do what they do.
How could it happen? It's a question that's been asked again and again in regards to the violence and the targeting of Jews in Nazi Germany. The events of that time and place is one of the prime examples of what groups of people are capable of. So what changes when individuals organize?
Our work focuses on two core dynamics. One revolves around legitimacy. And the idea here is, what do people think is acceptable to do in a particular situation? And identities, in a sense, drive that notion of legitimacy. They give us a sense of what is proper. What's the proper behavioural response to this situation? The other dynamic revolves around power. And this is about possibility. So, given that we want to do something, is it actually possible to do that? So it may well be that you've got a situation with one person walking down the street and he sees a situation where a man is attacking a woman. Say two men are attacking a woman. And he feels, well, in this circumstance, I think it's important I intervene. But he might recognise that in that intervention, he would subsequently be subjected to physical violence and might be harmed. So while he might feel that it's right and proper to act, he doesn't feel powerful enough to do it. Now all of a sudden, if that guy is then surrounded by another 15 of his friends, all of a sudden the power relationship to the situation changes, and now that person can exercise this sense of who he is as a guardian of moral values and justice, and intervene to prevent this crime from happening. And that's very much about a change of power. And that's why crowds are so important, because they are a place in which people become powerful, and they are a place in which power is confronted, because by becoming empowered, people are then enabled to challenge, to confront, to disrupt. And to many people, that's why crowds are enjoyable. That's why people like to be in crowds, because in many other aspects of our lives, we are forced to live in subjugated power relations. But all of a sudden, when we get into a crowd, we can, one English expression is mob up. But that process is a process of power, not a process of irrationality.
So whatever ideas you have about certain issues, you'll commit to your ideas more strongly if the ideas are shared within a group. You are empowered. And if there's a collective acceptance of violence, you as an individual are more likely to commit violence. Because who knows, if you wouldn't go along, you could be ostracized or, so to speak, not get any of the shared meat. So a deep-rooted idea seems to have to be present here too. Stanley Milgram showed us how. It's often said his experiments tested how far a human subject would go in continuing to electrocuting another person, just because they're told to do so. But that isn't really what the test showed. The test result did not show that humans will blindly follow orders to hurt others. The test showed that 2/3 of humans would go to great lengths and even hurt another person because they had been convinced that it would be critically important to scientific research and to society's progress. They had bought into an idea.
Experiment, that's all. It was around about 60% of people, 2/3 of people who went through the paradigm, in one of the paradigms, took the shocks up to the level and beyond of lethal electric shocks. And they argued that experiment, that this shows that people will obey a pernicious authority. And it shows how dangerous the social is. But what we are now in a position to do is to take a program of work by some very influential social psychologists, Steve Reich and Alex Haslam, who've been revisiting these original studies and showing how clearly they misunderstood. So, for example, most people think that there is just the one Milgram experiment, but actually kind of like 42 different variations of it. And in some of those variations, people didn't conform at all, people didn't obey at all. In others, they obeyed at 100%. So the issue isn't so much why do people obey, it's what is it about the conditions and the circumstances that lead to different variabilities in the extent to which people obey. And when we look at those different variabilities, we find some really, really interesting things. And one of the things is that this isn't about obedience, it's followership. It's the idea that people were buying into the importance of science. They were told this is a scientific study by eminent university, and this knowledge is really, really important. And it's important because scientific knowledge plays a role for the benefit of society as a whole. And in this context, because of the importance of that knowledge, and because the subjects, essentially the participants, they buy into that idea, the suffering of the individual in the other room becomes incidental to the social good. It becomes legitimate to do this to other people because ultimately the pain they suffer provides a benefit to society as a whole, and we just have to do it. And it's that struggle of identity in the room, identity with the victim or identity with the scientist, that helps us to understand whether or not people are going to obey in a circumstance. So it's a much more complex understanding of what can flow from these studies that stands at odds with these early, essentially misinterpretations and misrepresentations of these early studies.
Why do we need to know about human aggression, from where violence originates? I believe that any mental state that we find ourselves in, or any feelings or urges that we have that we don't understand, make us discontent. When it comes to aggression, any lack of understanding or self-awareness can have consequences. I believe that the better we know ourselves on an individual level, the closer we will be to living life to its fullest. The closer we will be to leaving anywhere a better place than when we arrived. And the more unlikely it would be that we would find any point in oppressing another human being. The world isn't going out of control. Our societies are not plunging into violent chaos. At some point in early modern history,
Somebody stood up and said, perhaps a few less suspected witches should be burned at the stake that day. And things continue to improve.
We're getting better and better. I mean, we still have our Darwinian background in our brains, but we are getting more and more civilized, more and more kind, less and less cruel, more and more empathetic. As the centuries go by, it's not a smooth increase, it's a jagged sawtooth. It goes down as well as up, but on the whole, the trend is towards up. And that's without our genes changing in the right direction. And so we're getting better because of increased civilization, education. The zeitgeist is changing. Slavery has been given up. We now respect women more. We don't send children down the mines. We're less cruel to animals. All these things are cultural changes, and they've been happening through the centuries.
in many ways we manage to deal with aggressive behavior and violence once it occurs. We don't carry on without challenges, and certainly not without abominations. But most societies have acceptable functions and institutions in place to try and keep most of us safe. Violent and sexual offenders or murderers are generally held responsible for their acts. And many of our societies even take into account the physical or psychological past of any individual who faces judgment.
Man kan ändå när man tittar på mänsklighetens utveckling tycka sig se över tid en civilisationsprocess. Att, så att säga, samhällets vardagsfungerande ändå blir mindre aggressivt än över tid, så att säga. Att man till exempel att man har man har en sån sak som trafikregler som fungerar väldigt bra. En situation där man kanske för 500 år sedan skulle betrakta den här resan som du har gjort nu hit till Umeå skulle kanske för 500 år sedan betraktas som förenat med betydande livsfara. För bland annat med tanke på hur man skulle ta sig hit, interagera med människor man mötte på vägen och så vidare. Och nu har vi regelsystem och så där man inte ens, du behöver inte ens vara orolig i någon större utsträckning innan för om du ska bli liksom nedslagen utav rövare längs vägen eller något sånt där, va? Utan det är artiga människor möter en hela vägen och du kan förutsäga hur, om du åker bil till hotellet från flygplatsen, så kan du förutsäga ungefär hur de andra bilarna kommer att agera och räkna med att det kommer inte att bli liksom bråk om territorium eller resurser på vägen eller så.
We've seen that if you bring any hateful idea into the life of an already neglected or abused human child, perhaps a child who has gene variations that code for more aggressive behavior, you might end up with a perfect storm. Introduce education, self-examination and compassion, and we would probably be able to bring calm to a lot of storms. But the point doesn't have to be as grand as that. The point is that we all carry variations of the same remnant DNA. We are all influenced by life experiences. So aggression and potentially violence is one of many parts of any human being's behavior. But we are not aggressive by nature. Nor are we kind by nature, generous, passive, compassionate or cruel. We are all of that by nature. And the ways to express our human nature have multiplied. We might chase numbers of likes or subscriptions to our social media channels, and we constantly find new ways to impress our peers or a potential partner. We use everything from cardboard signs to our Twitter accounts to let each other know which lives we think matter the most, which political issue is the most important. And if someone else has a different idea, we try to shout louder or we start to use violence. What often seems to be the case, though, is that we're left with noise, aggression, without any purpose. We're left with violence. I believe that a lot of this noise, most of this behavior, this aggressive behavior, is about each of us trying to find meaning, a place, about claiming territory and about how we appear to peers and partners, more than about a passion for an issue or trying to find a solution to a problem. We are, all of us, ordinary savages, enlightened savages perhaps. We are also, so far, the most developed species on Earth. Our anatomy is so well organized that we have become intelligent enough to have self-awareness. We are questioning our own purpose, searching for a cause and asking for the meaning of life. And we want our meaning to be more meaningful than that of other people. Because just as when we were hunter-gatherers, we want our share of the meat. Make no mistake about it, it's our ancestral programming that make us try to impress others by shouting out our opinions, by posting selfies or pictures of our beautiful homes. It's our ancestral programming that make us criticize others for doing the same. It is our programming that make us shout at someone from inside our car or push a stranger out of the way in a line somewhere, that make us subjugate another person. Can you think of any fight or war that have ever originated anywhere else than with one single individual? Sure, with an individual in a certain context, but still. We often hear that conflict and violent events have a, quote, long and complicated history. However complicated a certain history is, everything begins and ends with actions by the individual. If we know why we are sometimes hit by feelings of rage or why we may feel disrespected or offended,
then perhaps we would be able to rise above those feelings. We are part of the same evolution. Each and every one of us individually is a totally indispensable part of the universe. And everything we think, feel and do is part of this magnificent evolution. You are history. Without you, as you are, the Earth and its population would not be the same. Not now and not in a million years. If we understand and even accept that, who knows, we might get closer to ending the discontents of civilization. I believe in the good in human beings. I believe in some kind of light in all of us. And when we understand that we have a shared history, a shared ancestry, and eventually the same exact shared ending, that is true self-awareness.